Your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, Chief Storymaker and your host of this podcast. We share stories for many reasons. We want to persuade, we want to entertain, and we want to connect. But what we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're being perceived by the people you're sharing them with. In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you and you'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into lessons from each of those stories. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? Well, when I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, but not to respond necessarily. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your related stories, and think about which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Today's podcast features Whitney Johnson, author of one of my favorite books, Disrupt Yourself. I've gifted this book quite a few times over the past few years because I love the analogies she uses. She uses business terms like disruption and S-curve to better understand and develop our personal career and professional shifts. In addition to her work as a speaker and advisor, Whitney is one of Marshall Goldsmith's original cohort of 25 for the 100 Coaches Project. She's a coach for Harvard Business School's Executive Education Program, a frequent contributor to Harvard Business Review, and hosts the outstanding weekly podcast, Disrupt Yourself. You'll find more about Whitney, including links to follow and to connect with her on the blog post associated with this podcast at elkinsconsulting.com. Whitney Johnson, what a pleasure to finally get to speak with you. It's been a long time. We've known each other at least 5 years, just online, just virtual relationships. And I'm so grateful that you're taking the time to be on the podcast. So thank you.
Well, I'm so happy to be here. And it's really nice to meet you too, Sarah.
It's so funny. When I asked you to be on my podcast, the first thing I thought about was the fact that you inspired me to start blogging in such a personal way that it changed everything about how I present myself online. So I have to thank you for that.
You're welcome. Who knew, right? That one small ask and request, what that led to.
It's funny that you say that because there are so many opportunities that we have to ask for help because people really want to help. And if we don't ask, if we don't tell them what we want, then they can't know.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right.
So first things first, I always ask my guests to share something about themselves that most people wouldn't know. And the reason I ask that is because we're going to get into some pretty personal stories. And I like to give our listeners just a little insight into who you are so they feel a little bit stronger connection before we jump into personal stories.
Yeah. So when I get asked a question like this, I try to go with the first thing that comes into my mind because I feel like that's just going to be more more real, like we're actually having a conversation sitting across the table from each other and not being recorded. And so the thought that came into my mind is that I've never really cooked much at all. I knew how, I could follow a recipe, but my entire adult life, I've never cooked. My mom was a good cook. My husband's a good cook. I've never cooked a Thanksgiving dinner. I know how to make chocolate chip cookies. I can follow a recipe. But the thing that people don't know is that they probably think I cook. And I've just now started cooking. And the thing that's been super exciting and fun for me is just that experience of cooking. I usually do really simple meals. I tend to use the crock pot because crock pots are magic, where I can just put everything in there. And then 4 hours later, voila, we have a meal. But that's been something that people probably don't know. They would expect that I cook. And it's just been a really fun experience for me of learning how to do that. It's very creative. It's very tangible. And it's also a way that I can show my husband and my daughter, my one child who's still at home, that I love them and I'm thinking about them. So that's something that people don't know about me.
That is funny. I would never have thought that. So that definitely fits the question. And I think partly because I know how hard you worked to be present with your family. And to me, that always equates to food, cooking and providing food, because that's what I do. But it's so funny that that wasn't part of your demonstration. So what do you think you did? I know our children remember things so differently than we do, But what do you think you did that was that kind of the equivalent of cooking for your family?
Um, that's a really good question, Sarah. And I think that I have gotten much, much better at parenting over the years. I think part of the reason I didn't cook is there was some element of me that was trying to have my stake in the ground as a person. And I felt like somehow I was subjected to others if I cooked. So I think there was some element of that. I think one of the things I have done to show my children that I love them and is to, when they have an opinion, to honor that opinion. And when they have an idea, to honor that. I think I remember a few years ago, one of my friends saying to me, your children are 10 years old. And when they talk to you, you talk to them like they're real people. And so I think that that's one of the things, and I wouldn't have known that about myself because I was just talking to them. But I do think that that's something that I've done, is to be able to, when my children talk, just to like value who they are and like actually believe that they have something worthwhile to say.
That is definitely a huge demonstration of love. And even more important when the children are little is respect.
Mm.
So they know you love them, but when you can demonstrate that respect.
Yeah. You know what's funny though, Sarah, is I feel like as they've gotten older, I'm not as good at it. And I'm having to really work hard on it, because I find that now they've got, now it's not just sort of humoring them that they have an opinion. Now they're, wrestling with what should I study in college and where, what college should I go to? And I find that the advice monster just loves to come out like, you should do this and this and this and this and this. And so I'm having to kind of relearn that, or certainly learn it as an adult. But it's actually a really exciting place to be, because our children are 22 and 18, and exciting to be in this place of like, I get to figure out how to parent adults. And that's a completely different skill set. And to think that I've got, 20, 40, 60, maybe not 60, but, a lot of years to learn how to parent my adult children. And that's a really exciting prospect to me.
I would not have thought of it that way, but you're right. I think, I kept feeling like I was getting better and better as a parent as my children grew, but ours are 17 and 20. And I'm finding that same difference that when they were little, I felt like I was pretty good at it. And as they got older, I thought, wow, I'm getting better at this. And then all of a sudden, last year when our son turned 19, our older son, I felt like I was a terrible parent, that I didn't really know what I was doing anymore. And a few of my friends had to remind me that we gave them the foundation, that childhood of love and nourishment, and generally at our dining room table. But I never thought of it that way, getting to learn how to parent adults, because I know so many times it is. And sometimes it feels like they're parenting us. I mean,
oh, absolutely.
Especially when they say something wise.
Yes. Well, I'll give you an example. So just the other day, or like this is in the last month, our daughter says to us, I feel like when we have downtime, what we end up doing is watching TV, because that's like a way to kind of relax. And she said, I don't feel like we're getting enough face-to-face conversation. So I want to start playing games, board games. And I don't like playing board games. Like, I do not like them. And I think it's because I'm really, really competitive. And so I'm like, really, I've got to do this competitive thing and I want to win. And so I've never liked playing board games, but she's like, no, I really want to do them. And so she basically leading the way of saying, Mom, Dad, we need to not watch we don't watch a ton of TV. It's like maybe an hour or two, but during those precious evening hours, let's sit down and look at each other and play a game together and interact. And so we bought 2 games. One's called King of Tokyo, I think, and Sagrada. They're both really fun. Sagrada is like a fancy Yahtzee. But we've started playing games together. And that's because our daughter said we need to change a little bit of the family dynamic. And it's fascinating how, if we're willing to, you're right, Sarah, we can have our children really start to be great teachers for us and help us develop. I've long thought that, no one, even excluding our spouse, there's no one that is so aware of our underbelly, but also so invested in our being successful and so loves us and our children. Like, they can see us at our worst, but also see our best. And so they are probably even better positioned than our spouse or our partner to give us advice that can make us better people.
Oh my gosh. Can you say that again, but to my mother? I can
Sure.
help with that.
Hey, Sarah's mom. When Sarah is giving you advice, it's because, yes, she sees your weaknesses, but she loves you. She wants you to succeed. She is the flesh of your flesh, the issue of you. And so, I mean, it's hard, but it really is true. And so whenever our daughter does that, I think, okay, she wants me to succeed. Like, she loves me. This is important to her. And so I try to take it in that spirit.
That's so funny. I just realized I just had a visit from my mother, and I just realized that my advice monster comes out way more with her than it does with her children.
Interesting.
And now that you say that, I do know the soft spots. I do know her sensitivities and what hurts her feelings. And this is going to get far too deep into a counseling session. So I'm going to skip over the rest of what my thought was. But this is really a topic that I hadn't really gotten into at all. And it's something that I definitely will be considering and thinking about for quite a while. And you can expect an email in the near future.
I will look forward to it, Sarah.
Well, thank you. I guess we should get into the meat of our conversation, the main topic, which all of this leads into beautifully, because it's such a complimentary conversation. Here we are talking about the advice that we give to our parents or we get from our children, which is kind of backward when you think about it directly. And then leaning into the disruption of our lives that changes things for the better, even when at the time it doesn't seem like it's going to. Right. And the reason I reached out to you specifically is because of the two books, the Dare, Dream, Do, but the Disrupt Yourself book was the one that really spoke to me. So I'm really curious about which pivot point in your life, whether it was in your young adulthood, your childhood, or even when you moved to New York, whatever that incident was that made you realize that you could associate this business concept with your personal trajectory.
Oh, okay. So your question is, at what point did I realize that there was this theory to explain my lived experience? Is that the question? Okay. Yes. Yeah. So I would say, so when that happened is I was now working on Wall Street. So this was like the early 2000s. So about 15 years ago. A little bit more than that. Yeah, no, about 15 years. And I was working as an equity analyst. I was covering stocks, Latin American telecom and media. And I was responsible at Merrill Lynch for building these financial models and saying this stock's a buy, this stock's a sell, et cetera. And I came across a book called The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School. And I read that book and I went, wow, this is really interesting. This helps me understand what's happening with in Mexico in particular, where every single quarter, the wireless company, América Móvil, was beating my estimates. Telmex, the wireline company, wasn't. I was like, oh, this theory explains what's happening. It's wireless is disrupting wireline. That's what's happening. So that was really interesting, really intriguing for me. But the more I read the book and the more I thought about it, I thought, oh, okay, so here I am. I've been at this company for about 5 years. I've been an equity analyst for almost 10 years. I'm ready to do something new. I had gone to management and said, I'd like to look at moving on to the management track. And they're like, no, we like you right where you are. And so I've now read The Innovator's Dilemma and had this like kernel of an idea that this theory of disruption that says this silly little thing will take over the world like Netflix did to Blockbuster and the telephone did to the telegraph, that this actually applied to people. And I remember actually almost the page where I was reading, I remember having this experience of like, this applies to me. And if I stay here, I'm not going to be able to do what it is I want or need or, hope to do, whatever that was. It was very amorphous at that point, but somehow I was going to have to do this. And so that was the kernel of an idea that this theory actually applied to people. That was probably in 2004. And then it unfolded and unspooled over time. But that was the first time that I remember having some idea around that this could help explain my lived experience today, but also that it meant it also applied to me and going forward.
I can hear where that would kind of set that kernel. And it just makes me curious, what do you think was that, in your example, you have the wireless versus wired and that disruption of that industry. What do you think was the disruptor for you?
Oh, interesting question, Sarah. So I think what's interesting about personal disruption, and what happened for me from there is, okay, this applies to me. And then over the, intervening years, I started to think, okay, well, the big difference with personal disruption is that with personal disruption, I'm the telephone and I'm the telegraph. I'm Toyota and I'm General Motors. I'm Netflix and I'm Blockbuster. So I'm disrupting myself. And so in this particular instance, I was going to have to say, okay, here's where I am and I can stay here, or I can disrupt myself and go do something new and start all over again. And basically in time, again, as the theory evolved for me, I started looking into S curves and thinking, oh, these S curves actually can also apply to people. So that was as the idea started to evolve. And so here I was at that point in time, and not having the language to describe it, but I was at the top of a learning curve, whether it looks like a wave or a roller coaster. And in order for me to do something new, I was going to have to jump to the bottom of a new learning curve. So those are the words that I put on it now, but that was the experience that I was having.
So really, it's an internal driver, something that triggers that internal desire first to disrupt, and then possibly a specific thought that then disrupts everything you believed before.
Right. So I think, so it can happen a couple different ways, but yeah, so you're in this place and everything looks good. And in general, you're like, everything's working. But then there's this piece of you says, but I got to do something new. Like I have to. And we now know from the neuroscience that part of why you have to is that you're not learning anymore. Like your brain's not enjoying the feel good effects of learning. And so your brain says, okay, you've got to go do something new. It's like the cycle of life. You've got to have spring, summer, winter, fall. You get to the top of a learning curve. It typically goes about 4 years. You've got to jump to the bottom of a new learning curve and start all over again. And so what happens to us is once we've gotten to a certain level of mastery and sort of stuckness, on the face of it, it's like, well, everything's working. Like you're making enough money. You've got this great title. You've got this great position. Why wouldn't you just stay here? And you say, well, I could, but if I do, I will die inside a little. And so I'd rather take the risk of trying something new and potentially die, at least temporarily, but then I won't die inside. And so you make that decision to do it. Now, there are times, Sarah, where you get disrupted. In fact, and both will accomplish it. Like I can disrupt myself or I can be disrupted. I do have a theory and I can't prove it, but I think that sometimes the reason people lose their jobs, and I think this certainly happened to me because I've been fired, is that we lose our jobs because we're at the top of a curve and we know we should go and we won't go because we're scared to go. And so the universe gives us that little nudge that we need because it knows that we need to disrupt ourselves and we're not quite to the point where we're willing to do it.
That brings me to two thoughts. I mean, this whole trajectory, the idea of jumping and your neuroscience, the fact that you are born to continue to learn. That's what drives human beings. The two thoughts that just popped into my head is, first of all, the people who don't understand that and they hit that curve and they stay there, they don't necessarily get disrupted. I'm thinking specifically of government employees that get super comfortable in a position and just wait out for their retirement. It seems to me that they end up disrupting themselves in other ways by sabotaging themselves.
Or other people.
And other people in many cases. I have a vision in my head of a certain person that has done that because they're bored, but they don't understand that there are other ways to get past that. And
right,
so
that's absolutely right. Yeah.
And oh my gosh, I've seen that a lot. And it's not necessarily at work, even though it touches work, because everything does. You can't separate your personal and professional lives. So it ends up, they work through other avenues to earn that feeling that they're moving, even though it's not productive or positive.
Right.
So that was my first thought. And
yeah.
I could describe a specific incident where I was sabotaging myself and I could have been fired, but instead I leapt, and decided, okay, clearly I'm doing something to sabotage myself. Why? And then I realized that I was bored. But the other thing that popped into my head is when we don't know, I think most of the time when we have that disruptive thought, that kernel that sits there for a little bit and then triggers some action, most of the time I don't think we know when that has happened. What do you think? I mean, we could look back and say, oh, that's when that happened.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's something it grows slowly. It's just like a seed in the ground. We don't know when it starts to actually take root. It's a seed, and then at some point it does. What I would say though is that part of what I'm trying to do with the work that I'm doing is to put some structure around this and have people have some markers for themselves. In fact, I put together this worksheet because someone said to me, I was doing this big training for this organization a couple of weeks ago, and they said, well, how do you know where people are on the learning curve? And we have this diagnostic that you can take where people can assess. But some of the ways that you'll know if someone's at the top of a curve, and therefore, if you're at the top of the curve, is if you don't need, in fact, I'm going to go down this list, if you don't need a lot of direction and you can actually provide input. If you find yourself saying or thinking things like, that's not how we do it here, like, it's been done, it's been tried, it won't work. Our output may actually start to slow down or get sloppy because we're not learning. And so we're just not as engaged. I can do it tomorrow. It'll be done tomorrow. We don't feel that sense of urgency or energy to push. We can have a fear of being replaced. And so it can lead to, and you alluded to this a minute ago, of this gentle mobbing that takes place of people who are trying to climb the curve. It's almost like we're standing on the top of the mountain and throwing grenades at them. Like, okay, we don't want you to move up, because if you move up, then that hurts me. And then we also know that once we're at the top of the curve, there's a sense of around the people around you, is you sort of start to look to them and say, what's your vision? Or from your boss, what's your vision for me? And what's next? A sense of, I need something here, folks, because I'm starting to die. And so you can either be, you tend to be bored and or scared. And so I don't know that we know exactly when that happens, but from our research, you can use, 4 years as certainly a starting point of a marker. It can happen earlier if you get hired into a job and you already know what you're doing. But those are some qualitative things that you can look at where you're just not as excited to go to work. And it's not because you don't know how to do it. And it's not that you don't like the people you work with. It's just not as exciting as it was because you're not getting the dopamine that comes from when you're learning.
I'm thinking back on a very specific incident when I was at work at a job that was really not a good fit for me. And I felt comfortable suddenly after about 2 years.
Yep.
And I remember, and I've written about this, I wrote an email and hit send. And right before I hit send, I thought, this is going to stir things up. Like, I absolutely knew that when I sent this, something was going to happen. And I underestimated the response. I just assumed I'd get a little slap on the wrist. But it was a firestorm that I started, and it was silly. I mean, it shouldn't have.
But subconsciously you did it on purpose.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember hitting the send button and then almost immediately feeling the consequences. And then it's funny because I didn't blame the other person, even though I knew she was overreacting, because I knew I had done it to myself and to her to a certain extent. I was antagonizing.
Yeah.
I was antagonizing. Mm-hmm. Well, fast forward to about 2 years later when I was at my next job, and again, the 2-year mark, and I had this email written, and I stopped myself. I looked at it and I thought, oh no, you must be bored. What?
Well, that was your marker. That was your marker, right?
Marker. And from that point forward, I could look at when I start to feel those sensations, of sabotage, of self-sabotage, that I'm clearly in that point of boredom. And usually it's the 2-year mark. I can see it. And so I'm curious if you've had that kind of marker, those ahas in a specific instance where you went, oh, that's what this is, from a previous experience.
That's interesting. So it's interesting for you that it happens so quickly. It suggests to me that you're moving into new jobs, not at the low end of the curve, but already in the sweet spot. So there's not as much for you to figure out, or you're just a really quick learner. It could be a combination of the two. So that's interesting.
I'll take the quick learner.
Okay. Give me the quick learner. You know what I would say, Sarah, is I can think of one instance. This isn't me being at the top of the curve, but me being on a wrong curve. So, which is similar, because once you get to the top of the curve and you stay there too long, that starts to be the wrong curve as well. But I remember this was about 4 or 5 years ago. No, actually just 3 years ago, 3-4 years ago, where I was working on launching an investment fund with 2 other partners that was going to be focused on investing in women. And we thought, okay, given the credentials of the 3 of us, we thought we were going to be able to raise money really quickly. And like a year later, we still had not raised any money. None. None. I mean, maybe, I don't know, $500,000, but like nothing. And I kept on doing it and doing it and doing it. And this was when my first book, Disrupt Yourself, was coming out, to the point that it's like 2 months before my book's coming out. And I'm not focused on the launch of the book. I'm focused on trying to do this fund. And I remember kind of looking back and going, oh my goodness, I am not eating my own cooking. Speaking of cooking, if you think about the right curve, wrong curve, it's like, are you playing where no one else is playing? Are you playing to your strengths? Is it hard but not debilitating? And number 4, are you gaining momentum? And we clearly weren't playing where no one else is playing. At this point, people were raising a lot more funds around women. I wasn't playing to my strengths. Like, it was one of my strengths, but it wasn't my highest strength. I'm doing my highest strengths now. It was debilitating, like it was discouraging, and we certainly were not gaining momentum. And I remember looking back at that and being like, duh. Like, it took my husband saying to me, my truth teller husband, what are you doing? This is not gaining momentum. Why are you still doing this? And so that was, and again, you can actually have that at the top of a curve as well, because if you're at the top, time's passing and there's no momentum because you're flattening out. So it can apply at the top, but it can also apply when, you're at the bottom of a curve and it's not working. So that's the one example that comes to mind for me.
So there you are talking to your husband. Tell me it was at the dinner table. Is that where he said it to you?
No, we don't. Yeah. So because I have always traveled so much, we don't tend to have dinner table types of conversations. It ends up either being when we're taking a walk, because we do take a lot of walks together. That's something that we've always done a lot of. Or probably talking on the phone while I'm traveling, or downstairs before or after we're watching TV. Sometimes before we go to bed, but usually it's more of like when we're walking and talking and processing.
So you're walking, talking, you're processing, and he says this to you. What was your immediate response? Were you a little defensive, or was it like that immediate light bulb? And then what did you do next?
Yeah. So I knew he was right. I think that's, so I'll give you 2 thoughts. One is that I then had to, what was hard about it is I had to go to my 2 partners and say, I got to be out. That was the hard part. Not so much that I didn't know it was the right decision, but more, if I'm being honest, and that's the conversation that we're having, is that I didn't want to tell them that I was out, because, we had put in this time and energy, and I was like, I'm done. And that was hard for me to have to say to them, in part because I want them to like me, and saying you're not going to be in means that they might not like you. And that's always hard. And I think it's hard for everybody, but I do think it tends to be harder for women than for men.
I think it's also harder for women who have that strong sense of responsibility and commitment.
Yes, that is true. So that was difficult. Even though I knew, I was like, yeah, he made the right decision. I think the thing that's been important for me, and this has been something that I have learned over the years, is that, and this is part of kind of growing up, I think, and growing into a marriage, is that there have been times when my husband has said, I don't think that's a good idea. He would never tell me not to do something. He's never done that. But he would say, strenuously, I don't think this is a good idea. And I did it anyway, because I thought that I should and wanted to. big, big, big mistake. And so one of the things that I've learned, gotten much, much better at the last, I'd say 3 to 5 years, is that when my husband feels strongly about something, like really strongly about it, then I probably don't do it, or I certainly consider it or try to get us to hammer it out so that we can get to the point where we do agree or not. And I think that's an important part of growing up, and certainly in terms of a marriage and a relationship.
Yeah. I was just thinking about, of course, it brings me immediately to my relationship with my spouse, and we have a very similar relationship. He rarely says, this is a bad idea, but when he does, I listen now. And there was a time when I didn't, early in our marriage. And I'm reminded of just recently when I said something to him about something I wanted to do. And he said, probably need to think about that a little bit longer. and I didn't get defensive at all. It was like, oh yeah, okay, you're probably right.
Right.
You're usually right.
Yeah. And again, going back to a spouse, like if you've been married for a while, like they love you, they have your back. And so they're not telling you that because they don't love you or don't respect you or don't admire you or anything like that. They're just like, I don't think this is in your best interest. I don't think it's in our best interest. Please reconsider. They'll still do it with you if you want to, but you learn from, to quote the Music Man, on many occasions I've been a sadder but wiser girl. And so, I know better now. Like, I make sure that we have that conversation.
I love the Music Man. When I worked at the local library in circulation, our boys were little and I just needed health insurance because my husband he had left a company to be self-employed. And I would come home. I had LASIK surgery, so I used to wear glasses. And I'd come home and I'd tell my husband these stories about people who walked in and obviously had a librarian thing, which I didn't know was a thing until I worked at a library. And I got home, and every time my husband would just laugh and he'd start singing the Marian the Librarian song.
Marian, right?
Yes, exactly. It's hilarious. Okay.
My high school put on the musical and I played the piano for it. I think twice. Or at least once. So yeah, I know the music. Okay. Anyway. All right.
Okay. So we can actually get back to that first question because I didn't know you played piano. Do you still play piano?
Well, that's actually a really interesting, speaking of pivot points. So yeah, I studied music in college, and when we went to New York, in part because I was just sort of done with music. I think I had been doing it because my parents wanted me to, but I didn't feel a love for it at that point at all. Like, I had no interest in doing music, even though we had gone to New York. So for really, many years, I've played little to not at all, except for the occasional accompanying someone when they sing in church, or sometimes playing the organ in church, although I don't play the organ. I'm a pianist who plays the organ. But in the last, I would say 3 to 4 months, I've been thinking, I really want to play piano again, and thought about doing classical, but classical just doesn't do it for me. I thought about doing jazz, which I had dabbled in a little bit in college, but that was feeling kind of overwhelming to me. So I was like, you know what, I'm going to try gospel piano. And so what I've been doing is I've been basically watching YouTube videos. And like, okay, so I find this YouTube video of this guy, Dave Holland's music, and he shows how to do like this 1 chord progression. He's like, okay, here's how you do it. And he does it all by rote. So he's like, you do this note and then this note and then this note. And he goes, and then play it in every key. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to play it in every key. And it's just so fun because I'm learning by rote and a little bit by ear, and a whole different genre that I don't know anything about. So I don't have any expectations other than I don't know anything, so I'm going to learn. So there's none of that baggage. And then, I love the idea of music and how music can help you worship. And so that's something I've been doing. So I have this goal to do piano 15 minutes a day when I'm home. And if I'm not, then listen to a video. And did you know, this is super exciting to me, 15 minutes a day for a whole year is 90 hours. 90 hours. That's amazing, right?
That's hard to think about, to wrap your head around.
Pretty cool though, right? Because you just think, if I do
something for 90 hours, you can get really good at something.
Yes. And if you do it for 5 minutes a day, that's still 30 hours.
Wow. That's pretty inspiring. That gives me all kinds of ideas.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Anyway,
I'm,
so that's what I'm doing. Gospel.
I'm really glad you just told me that we veered into this direction, because what I'm hearing from you is that you are finding a different path right now. You're disrupting yourself again because you are looking at different creative outlets that you haven't really explored before. Because my understanding of being a music major or doing music specifically in college is that when you're doing it by music, you're using the sheet music, you're not necessarily improvising much, depending on the kind of music. Obviously, if you're doing jazz, it's a totally different thing, but now you are exploring cooking. You're finding a creative outlet in cooking, and you're going back to piano, but you didn't go back to sheet music piano. You're going to creative piano, improvisation. You're going to a type of music that you can't just go with the sheet music and feel comfortable in it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't think of that both of those things are coming out. Yeah. So there's this creativity piece. And in many ways, I would say a very, like if you look at from a Jungian standpoint, Carl Jung, it's really allowing that feminine to come out. And obviously I'm a female, but like just allowing that feminine side to really come out in a different way, which is really, really fun.
Wow. I just keep coming back to this whole idea of disrupting yourself in a different way. And I know it sounds kind of silly, I guess, but the way that I've seen this, remember earlier we talked about how people that are in that top of their curve and they either don't recognize it or they're just waiting out for retirement and they sabotage themselves in different ways. I just keep coming back to this idea that if they knew that about themselves and they still didn't feel like they could make a change, either because they're close to retirement age and they don't have the desire to jump into another S curve in terms of income, that they could take this idea of a creative outlet.
That's right.
Drive themselves into it, because that would be such a different and positive S curve to jump into without leaving where you are.
That's right, Sarah. I mean, to your point, there are times when you're at the top of the curve and like, for whatever reason, you can't jump. You might be the owner of the company. You might have a certain amount of, you've got a pension that you've got to stay with. And so you can, have some type of stretch assignment inside of the organization, or you can do something and say, okay, I'm going to do my work and I'm going to do a good job. And I'm going to find ways to jump to new curves. Or do a sort of side hustle, again, back if you're close to retirement, so that when you actually move into retirement, it's meaningful. I mean, we all know that there are people who get into retirement and they get depressed because all of a sudden their life has no meaning. And so part of what you're doing is, if you're on this curve and you're at the top and you start doing some other things that are creative, you're basically prepping yourself really to jump to a new curve. And so it's just part of that preparatory phase to your next curve of finding some other creative things to do.
So what do you think triggered this sudden need for creativity in your life? Did something happen? Are you in a different place right now? Because clearly something's going on.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. So we moved to Virginia about 3 years ago, and a lot of things shifted for us. So when we moved to Virginia, my husband, who had been a stay-at-home dad for 10 years, had now gone back to work. So he's a professor. He's the division chair for the sciences at a small liberal arts school, which is really unusual because he'd been in academia. He came out for 10 years and then came back onto the tenure track. Highly unusual for women, certainly super, super, super unusual for men. So there was that thing that happened for him. Our oldest son had gone on a mission for our church and then went to college. And then our oldest daughter is a senior in high school. So I think this confluence of moving to a different place, my husband jumping to his own new S curve, our son leaving for college, our daughter getting more and more sentient, if you will, of like, I remember her one time saying, I was sick and you guys didn't cook for me because she's vegetarian. And so we're like, well, we don't know what to cook for you. And realizing that actually mattered to her. Like it mattered to her that, for her, cooking a meal for her made her feel loved. So I think that was a catalyst as well. And I think also just for me professionally, things are going really well. And so I think there's this sense of me just continually trying to improve myself and feeling that there have been pieces of myself that I've kind of left closed off, like that sort of nurturing homemaking. And now I think, at least on the cooking side, that it's like safe for that piece of myself to come out and play now, that it won't somehow undermine what I'm trying to do from a professional standpoint. Because though women have made huge gains, huge gains compared to my mother's generation, there's still a long, long way to go. And so I think there was a piece of me of like, if I do that, am I going to somehow undermine what I'm trying to accomplish professionally? And so this sense of security of who I am, that I can start to let that piece of myself come out. It's safe, because the other piece that I've worked so hard to develop won't go away or somehow get undermined. And then on the piano, I think it's just that there's been enough time that's passed, and I've now allowed myself to just say, okay, piano can be mine now. And also finding a vehicle for doing it. Because I had thought classical, no, I tried a little bit of jazz. That wasn't working for me. But then I hit upon this gospel. I'm like, this works, because I hear the music and it just, and it's funny because I'm not evangelical Christian. So this isn't the music that I hear at my own church, but it still speaks to me in a very, very profound way.
You know, I'm not religious. I'm Jewish, but we are not religious Jews. We don't go to synagogue, but spiritual and gospel music speaks to me as well.
It's amazing, right?
Because, and the theory that I get into is, I've been to Christmas services. I've been to services in our cathedral here in Helena, Montana, which is one of the oldest west of the Mississippi. And the acoustics in that room are spectacular. And when I hear somebody singing gospel, and especially if I can watch them, but just hearing them in that environment and seeing what it brings to the people who are listening to it, that sense of community and being closer to each other and to, in their version of this, closer to God, that there is something so powerful about the passion that comes from that voice and that belief that's so strong. And so when I hear that, especially when it's harmonies, the hairs just go right up the back of my neck. Yeah. So yeah. Have you heard of Mary Mary?
Mm-mm. Mm-mm.
Oh, okay. So I'll send you a link later, and maybe I'll associate it with this podcast.
Oh yeah, do. Yeah.
I'll put a link to it. The song that I was telling you about earlier before we started recording was Wade in the Water. And they do a version of that is just incredible. And the other song they do, Can't Give Up Now, is another one of those super tight, complex harmonies, these voices that clearly believe so strongly and passionately that you can't help but feel something.
Yeah.
So I can understand why gospel speaks to you.
Yeah. There's just something about it that I was saying to someone the other day. I was actually in Nashville and at this business event, and like before lunch, they all started praying, and I was like, this is crazy. And I said to them, you know what I love about your faith is that you worship like your worship is whole bodied. Like you worship in this whole body sense. And like, I love that. And I think that the music, I think it's partly because the music allows people, or there's something about it that brings out sort of the whole body and whole being of people. It's just quite lovely.
And just to bring in one of my favorites, Brene Brown, it's also a sense of vulnerability. When you hear those sounds, you can't help but expose yourself in some way when you feel that. Yeah. Interesting. So, I know that you have a couple of other appointments this afternoon, so we will wrap this up so that you can move on. I know that you have taken a great time to visit with me, and I so appreciate it. So one last question. As you are disrupting yourself again by taking on this creative side, and I want to dive a little deeper into that whole thought about not cooking because that's associated with women at home and not necessarily professional women. I totally get that. And I'll dig into that some other time. But as you're disrupting yourself with these creative outlets, where do you see that going in terms of how it impacts your current professional life and what you're doing there? Do you feel like have you noticed an impact?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think the way it is, yes, I hadn't, but now that you're asking me the question, I let me talk through it. So I think, for example, one of the things I'm realizing is that, like at the very end of one of my keynotes around building a team, the metaphor I use around building a great team is a loaf of bread. And, baking fresh homemade bread. And not too long ago, I had my daughter teach me how to make homemade bread. And I think that what the implications for letting out this creative side, but also this very feminine creative side of myself, are that it means that as I'm out in the world and talking about personal disruption and focused on the business, et cetera, I think the implications are that I'm allowing all of myself to be in that workplace, so that I'm not doing it the way a man would do it, but I'm not doing it the way a woman who has none of the sort of technical training that I have. I'm not going all left brain. I'm not going all right brain. Actually, I shouldn't say woman or man, but just I'm not going left or right brain, although we do tend to associate those traits with men or women respectively, but to bring those two together and allow both of them to coexist. And I think that that's allowing me to be able to say what I need to say in a more grounded, meaningful, impactful way, because I'm not hiding a piece of myself. I'm bringing all of myself to the work that I'm doing.
So what you're saying is that through this creative outlet, you're finding different ways to connect with your audience that are more whole.
Yes, exactly.
I love that. That just made me so happy, because a lot of what I do with my coaching clients is encourage them to look for creative outlets. I find that when people start regularly doing something that makes their brain work differently, whether it's a coloring book and colored pencils, or taking a class at a ceramic art foundation, it tends to help people think differently and problem solve differently. So I love hearing that what it did for you is it brings you to a whole place, and whole by WHOLE.
Right.
So that you can really bring your whole self in a different way than you have in previous experiences. And I just love hearing that. So thank you for sharing that last little bit.
Absolutely.
So for our listeners, I will have a link to Whitney's books, and so that you can look into the ones that I highly recommend, particularly Disrupt Yourself. That's the one that I gift to people regularly. But all of the books, I will have links to her website and a couple of other links about things that we talked about earlier in our conversation. And I would highly encourage you to reach out and start following her on LinkedIn, and her podcasts are outstanding. So thank you, Whitney. I really appreciate your taking the time.
Thank you, Sarah, for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.